In a world overflowing with distractions, we seek meaning. How do we transform ambition into something deeper, into true fulfillment? I'm Sam Pepin, CEO of Course Educa, and I've spent years helping businesses succeed by connecting their goals to something bigger. On the Meaningful Podcast, we explore not just how to win in business, but how to grow as individuals. Through conversation with thought leaders, innovators, and everyday heroes, we uncover the stories that drive us towards something greater. Whether you're striving for success, seeking purpose, or just looking for the next steps in your journey, this podcast is your guide to navigating the intersection of ambition, growth, and meaning. So please join me and our incredible guests as we redefine what's possible in both business and life. Enjoy. In the pursuit of influence, we uncover the tools that shape legacies and define extraordinary success. Welcome to the Meaningful Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Pepin, and today we're diving into 3 transformative themes: the art of leading with empathy, the power of emotional intelligence, and building culture that thrives in a modern world. Our guest today is Eric Goodman, a dynamic entrepreneur and co-founder of i3 Empowerment Solutions. Eric's works bridge leaderships, communication, and innovation, equipping individuals and businesses to elevate their impact and income. From navigating AI in the workplace to unlocking emotional intelligence, Eric's insights are a masterclass in meaningful transformation. If you enjoyed this discussion, please let the world know with a like, a small review, or even a quick share. Your support helps more people find meaningful content just like this. Let's begin. Mr. Eric Goodman, welcome on the Meaningful Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's fantastic to have you on, and it was such a pleasure to see you again in Denver earlier this year. And to kick us off, please tell us more about i3 Empowerment Solutions.
So i3 Empowerment Solutions is all about transformation, and i3 stands for influence, impact, and income, both for individuals and businesses. So we're all about elevating those things. And with my partner, Mamie Lamley, we bring over 50 years of combined expertise, and our programs actually dovetail nicely with this podcast in terms of the Meaningful Podcast, because our programs are designed to help people really figure out their purpose, to unlock their potential, and to create a lasting legacy. And so we have a couple signature programs that are really involved with what we offer. One of which is called Ignite Your Passion, and it's a process of self-discovery, leveraging cutting-edge tools like AI and another personality methodology to help people scale their business. We have another program called Leveraging Up, but it's really, and that program is tailored for those who want to command the stage, launch dynamic podcasts, or maybe lead with purpose and precision. We do leadership development, training around communication, all sorts of things. But really, we're all about helping people not settle for ordinary when they can step into their greatness and achieve extraordinary things. And that's a little bit about i3.
Yeah, beautiful. And one thing that I always found remarkable about who you are, and like I said, I was able to meet you a few times, and it's truly always was staggering to me. And it is leadership. Is basically, I think a lot of your work and expertise over around the fact that you're such a potent leader in the business world. And I actually love what Simon Sinek as to settle that, which is leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge, which is a very different. It's kind of like a paradigm shift. With such lengthy expertise in leadership yourself, how would you describe leaderships, and perhaps tell me more about just how important it is in the business world?
Well, how important it is, let's start with that. I mean, in the business world, leadership is really everything, because if you think about any organization, without somebody leading that creates that vision, that is able to rally the troops. If you're trying to be at the head of an organization, no one's following you, you're just going for a walk. Like if you're out there, and so I love that idea of Simon Sinek, because I think it encapsulates that leadership is more than just a title. It's an act of service. So if you're taking care of those in charge, that's really key. And if you think about it, how often do we measure leadership by authority rather than empathy? And I'm a recovering academic, having earned my PhD and then spending over a decade as a business school dean and many years as a chief academic officer. So I had the opportunity to create programs for undergrads, even masters of leadership programs at a couple different universities, partnered closely with Franklin Covey and some other leading organizations. in the development of that. But I think, you can look at the work by Amy Edmondson out of Harvard on psychological safety, but I think Sinek challenges the notion around empathy a little bit. And he reminds us that true leaders create environments where people feel safe, supported, and empowered. And when it comes to that psychological safety, in a workplace where employees feel psychologically safe, there's some different statistics, but in general, they're about 50% more likely to collaborate and innovate. And that creates a ripple effect for a leader who cares. And so I think with Simon's work, Simon Sinek's work, actually, you have to ask yourself, are you leading with empathy? Are you creating a culture where your team can thrive even in uncertainty? And are you that person that listens, supports, inspires? Because after all, leadership isn't, what you do. It's who you uplift, and that those that are in your charge. How do you take care of those individuals? And so there's so many aspects and dimensions of leadership. I actually have a LinkedIn newsletter called Confidence in Leadership, where I write twice a week on different topics, everything from different theories of leadership, but more practical tips. And every article has actionable strategies, and I delve into neuroscience and AI and just a wide range of things that leaders need to be thinking about to maximize their potential.
And that's so important. That's so important. You mentioned empathy already a few times in your responses, and that's another thing that always I think I suppose was very insightful to me is this idea of unlocking basically emotional intelligence. And for you, emotional intelligence seems to be the foundations for effective leaderships, perhaps. And you just mentioned it with Simon Sinek, but also with basically anything else surrounding the arts of what it is to be a leader. When you're thinking about how we merge both the practical and tangible field, which is a leader is someone that basically some others follows, but also doing such things with delicacy and basically emotional intelligence. What are some tactics and tips and perhaps insight you can give us to become a more emotional intelligence leader?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question because, first of all, for those of people that aren't familiar with emotional intelligence, probably helpful to just give a quick summary. But basically, it's just your ability to recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions while being able to do the same in others. And depending on whose construct you look at, I mean, most of them have 5 key components: self-awareness, your strengths, understanding that, your weaknesses, what triggers you, what sets you off, and then how do you regulate those emotions in a constructive way? How do you motivate yourself? How do you motivate others? The empathy piece is a key aspect of it, and social skills. And so, leaders who foster trust and have high emotional intelligence are able to resolve conflicts and inspire their teams. And it's really the cornerstone. And one of the things in my years leading business schools that from employers I'd consistently hear is, we can teach these people. We had masters in accounting and finance and MBA students and executives in these programs where they were like, can't you just teach these people to have the skills? It was what they considered the soft skills, but they're the durable skills, the hard skills, really the most important skills, because we know that it's about getting along. It's about communicating. It's about working in teams, managing conflict, all those things. And that was the piece, the interpersonal soft skills that were always a struggle. So, for a leader to understand EI, and we know that IQ isn't what matters in someone's success in life, it's EQ that makes the difference. So in terms of, you asked the question about tips and like training a leader, I think one of the keys in terms of empathy, again, if you're going to be able to connect with somebody, first you got to understand yourself, and you can do that. And I have a really cool, quick 90-second tool I'd love to share with your listeners. If they just go to crackmycode.com/communicate, they'll get a free report. It'll take them 90 seconds and it'll tell them about their strengths and who they are, what's important and what is valuable to them. But the other part of that tool is it gives you tips on how to communicate with others, which is really the core of emotional intelligence, understanding yourself and then what makes other people tick. And when you do that, it's your ability to communicate in a way that's going to resonate with other people. And I think the biggest mistake leaders make, and I know with the great work you're doing in marketing and the neuroscience of that, is finding the meaning. And as a tool to very quickly identify what is meaningful to somebody else. It's game changing. And there's actually an AI tool that is built around that I can share more about later. But ultimately, it's about understanding where you're starting from. And then, of course, with that, it's active listening. And when you understand the values of somebody else and what's important to them, you're activating their meaning network, which is really key. And so practicing truly hearing what somebody says and not thinking about what you're going to say next and everything else. Because oftentimes in a conversation, particularly as a leader, you've got something a message you want to deliver, but you really need to have that. You need to ask those clarifying questions, and empathy, the ability to empathize, putting yourself in others' shoes. How would I feel in this situation? And even from another tip perspective and how you can take somebody else's perspective is, it may be in your HR department or with somebody else, a coach. Obviously, you have coaching as well, role playing, or even journaling from someone else's point of view. Like, no matter how thin you slice it, there's always two sides of things. And so understanding that, and then in that process, learning more, and this is something we train on, about, nonverbal cues. What is body language, tone of voice, facial expressions? Because a lot of times it's what's not said. It's those things between the lines, those unspoken emotions that are important. There's so many tips: seeking feedback, asking for input as a leader. You've got to be able to adapt to your needs. And I think that goes hand in hand with what we're talking about, because I know one of the mistakes I made as a very young, early 20 leader where I had 30 employees was I would learn the golden rule: treat others how I want to be treated. And I assumed that people wanted to be treated the same as I wanted to. And I discovered with one of my employees, we had a recognition celebration awards banquet, and I called him up on the stage. And it wasn't until afterwards I understood he was pretty upset by that. And I'm like, that I never even crossed my mind that someone would be upset about getting recognition. But for him, he was embarrassed. He wanted to be that person, that silent person behind the scenes, didn't want spotlight and everything else. And so it was my first inclination. And it wasn't until thinking more about later in my life, I guess, that it's not the golden rule, treating others how they want to be treated. It's treating them how you want to be treated. It's the platinum rule: treat others how they want to be treated. And that tool that I shared, again, crackmycode.com/communicate, gives you insights into other people very quickly in terms of what drives them. And, it's also then going beyond understanding the feelings as you step into their shoes, but, it's showing you care. And those small gestures, even taking the time to understand what's important in those conversations, can make a big difference. And, the bottom line is trust. And I think when you genuinely care about somebody else, and you understand where they're coming from, what they're going through, there's a lot of things that happen in people's lives, and we make assumptions. So those are a few things. And again, every week I've got tips on different things that someone can actually apply that day. And that's what I'm all about, because I think it's blending theory and practice, because there's a lot of theories out there, but until you can actually act on it, it's useless.
You mentioned something that I believe to be very relevant, and more relevant perhaps, which is the best way to actually ought to believe that somebody will be successful is not IQ, but it's EQ, which is something that we hear more and more often. And I was wondering, since IQ was always something that was a little bit, I will go as far as worshiped, especially in basically the 20th centuries, when you're thinking of that conclusion, which is EQ being even more relevant, perhaps in people of high success and high performer. Do you think that was always the case? Do you think that perhaps we just didn't firmly grasp what was EQ, since it's a much more complex and wider field, and a couple of texts that you can use to basically assess your IQ? Tell me more about that distinction, and if you think that that was always perhaps something relevant to our world.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's always been relevant. And I think, in life in general, and that same thing happens in business. What can you measure, and how do you measure it? And IQ, obviously, it measures cognitive abilities, logical reasoning, problem solving, analytical stuff, and so when you talk about emotional intelligence, you're looking at how we manage our emotions and relationships. And, obviously in the HR world and in leadership development and executive coaching and other things that I do, you're getting data points from different people, but EI often plays a bigger role, clearly, in terms of workplace performance and fulfillment. And it's really what drives leadership success. There's all sorts of different studies that are out there comparing the top performers, leaders that score high NEI versus those that are low performers. And what you see, that is the one construct that makes a difference. And really, it was Savoy and Mayer in the late 80s that came up with the term emotional intelligence, but Daniel Goleman popularized it in I think 95 with his book. But even, he says that more broadly, IQ accounts for only about 20 to 25% of success in life. And he said, obviously the rest is emotional intelligence. And so I think too, behind a certain, I guess behind all this is just the ease at which you can measure stuff, right? And I think the history around why IQ was built and everything else, and the higher IQ doesn't significantly increase your success rates in the workplace. I think beyond a certain threshold, if you get an IQ of around 120, like anything, there's a baseline marginal functioning of to be successful. And we know that there's data on emotional intelligence related to stress management. Emotional intelligent leaders are 4 times less likely to experience burnout. I did a significant amount of research on burnout among emergency medical physicians many years ago. And that data point, the 4 times, is based on some research from Gallup. But there's all sorts of different things out there. And I think, again, IQ just helps you solve those technical things. It's what I was talking about before, like those employers saying, can't you just teach people these interpersonal things, right? We can teach them the technical skills. We can teach them the masters in computer science or IT or accounting and finance to analyze data. But EI really is, how do you communicate with those, build trust, motivate teams, and do all those things? And it far outweighs IQ. There's no question about it. And there's thousands of studies. There's some really interesting meta-analysis where they've combined all of them to look at themes among the research comparing this. And I think it's, for anyone to think about, IQ gets you hired, EQ gets you promoted. And that's something that Daniel Goleman says. And I think true. Your success in moving up the ladder is that. And so for each person to think about, how are you leveraging your cognitive strengths, that IQ part, but your emotional intelligence as well, to lead and inspire your team. And then there's some other work. The higher you go, the less technical things you have. It's all about leading and having the vision to be able to bring a team together to execute.
Beautiful. Love that quote. Love that quote. And even some pretty relevant business coach and some quite influential business figures like Ned Penna, for example, said that with a lower IQ would make more money, since you tend to be more risk averse with a higher IQ and so on. And whatever your opinion is on that topic, personally, I'm actually obviously not a fan of those conclusions for myself, for example. But the reason why I think it's so relevant is because when you're thinking about, and I love what Peter Drucker said on this, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I want to transition here to culture, because that's another thing that you talk about so often. As you know, and you cite very correctly on your LinkedIn profile, a startling 50% of new business fails within the 5 years. We have some stats that is about upwards of 90% in the first 10 years, which is obviously cannot get more staggering than that. When you're thinking about your role and perhaps as a nurturer and somebody that basically can understand how to build relevant culture, would it be fair to say that the one that survives, the company that survives and thrive these days, are the one that have a biggest emphasis on culture and how their people not only feel, but I suppose interact in the workplace?
Yeah, I would say that's fair. And there's a lot of other research around that. I mean, you can go back to Peters and Waterman in Search of Excellence back in the day. I know you've read a lot of different Good to Great. I mean, the list goes on. And I actually saw Peter Drucker back in 1997. And I remember I was at a conference, and with Andy Grove was there as a speaker. And it was at an inflection point for Intel, and he had just written Only the Paranoid Survive and was shifting, from a microprocessor, like shifting the whole business model at Intel. But ultimately, and actually, let me come back to one other point before I address the culture piece, because I think it's so critical. And it's such a beautiful statement from Peter Drucker, because I remember he said, and I've got a shelf full of his books, that I've read over the years. And he said, you could forget about all these books I've written and the hundreds of articles I've written on leadership and business and management, and obviously the he was one of the key persons who defined efficiency versus effectiveness and doing the right thing versus doing things right and some of those distinctions. But he said, forget about all that. Just remember one thing in life. And if you want to be effective in business, and especially as a leader, you just need to maximize people's strengths and provide an environment that minimizes their weaknesses. And I think that speaks to this idea of culture, because a strong culture supports the organization's strategy, their goals. You can look at a company like Google or 3M that, looks at innovation and aligns its strategies to focus on creativity and maybe market disruption. Because as Peter Drucker says, when culture and strategy clash, employees will become disengaged and their ability to execute it's not going to happen. And you've got different types of cultures, of course, that some that are more adaptive and innovative, those that are stuck in the past. And you can look at things throughout history, like the Blockbuster versus Netflix scenarios where go by the wayside. But again, we've got a lot of toxic cultures. And so if a leader doesn't recognize how to shape their culture through their actions, decisions, and what they prioritize, that's really key. And probably the best culture model. And I've written articles and book chapters on culture. Edgar Schein, he famously said, the only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture. And I think that's really the crux of the matter, because poor leadership can derail even the strongest cultures. And so if you got somebody that doesn't understand the norms, the values, and everything else that exist, and there's multiple layers, I could talk for hours about culture, but I don't know if that answers your question or where you want to go from there.
No, absolutely. Well, culture is something that is tangibly felt. I think it's the best way that I would put it. It's something that it's above strategy and tactical and pretty much any sorts of implementations, because it's truly the incubator of everything that goes out. Any basically sorts of output would be determined by just not only how strong the culture is, but how relevant it is to the problem you solve with the business that you have. And one thing that is very interesting to me, and you mentioned this earlier in this conversation, is one of the few things you'll learn in your early 20s, managing basically different people and different personality types and introvert, extroverts, and so on. For you, when you're trying to assess a culture and you understand that people are different and therefore needs to be treated differently in the scopes of their personality and what they ought to achieve and so on, how can you put or is there one that you can basically a structure or a process in which you can basically follow as a leader, and if you're beginning in this world of just assessing a culture and trying to perhaps create a culture out of a company these days, is there anything relevant? So I suppose, what's the most effective ways that you were able to do such things when you're teaching others on how to make their culture better?
Sure. Yeah, well, let me start with one point and then I'll go there, which is, you talked about culture, you feel the culture, right? And so in that process, as a leader, you got to understand there's a lot of layers to that. And because the things you feel when you walk into a company or somebody's office or whatever, there's the visible elements of culture. It could be the office layout, how people are dressed, it's what you see, right? And then you've got your values, and a lot of times they're espoused values, like there's what they state on their mission or their website, or what their values and beliefs are. What they say versus maybe what they do are different. And then I think deeper than that, in Schein's model at least, is you've got underlying assumptions, and there's a lot of deep unconscious beliefs that really drive behavior. Because a company, and goes back to your point about, like, if you have a low IQ, maybe you'll take more risk. But a company might say it values risk taking, but have an unspoken assumption that failure isn't tolerated. So how does that align, right? And you can look at examples of IBM where people had miserable failures, but the CEO was like, fantastic, let's do more of that. Let's learn from that. Let's figure out how we can do, as long as we don't make that same mistake twice. But in terms of your question about building a relevant culture, I think the key is first, you got to clarify your purpose and your values, your North Star, or however you want to think about it. And understand, what do you stand for? What behaviors and beliefs will help us get to where we want to go, whether it's your vision or your mission, and how you get there. And then you've got to ensure that all of the layers in your organization and the culture are aligned: the systems, the strategies, the structures, the reward, the recognition, the compensation, all those policies and procedures that they actually support what you say or what you're trying to do. And then when it comes to building a culture, like Jim Collins in Good to Great talks about, getting the right people on the bus. Like, you got to make sure you got the right people on the bus, but then also, are they in the right seats? So you've got to bring people in who align with your values, but also you don't want all the mini me's, right? You've got to have the diversity that are willing to challenge the status quo to prevent stagnation, and that also bring that diversity of perspective. And then you've got to be able to reinforce what those expectations are, not just in onboarding, but then beyond with the other systems you put in place, performance reviews and other day-to-day interactions. And I think the other thing for building a culture is, how do you create a culture where if you do want to encourage people failing faster, how do you make sure that, you're communicating that? And when groups come together to solve problems, engaging teams in tackling challenging solutions or problems with maybe collaborative solutions that reinforce, like, we are going to work together. And this is where I think when you get into IQ versus EQ, as an educator, it's ironic because I think in the education system, most of the time we're encouraging all this individual work. And it wasn't only until the last maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years that there's been more emphasis on teamwork and things that mirror actually what happens in the real world. And, in the past, people would be penalized for working. Like, that's cheating. Like, no, like, when was the last time you did an individual project in an organization without interacting with anybody? Like, just totally isolated without getting information or communicating something else. It just doesn't happen. So
It shouldn't happen. Most importantly, that's actually probably counterintuitive, but you must at least communicate if you have any sorts of relevance organization that surrounds you. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
And going back to the point about the failure in the market, I mean, some of that is internally, but you got to be willing to adapt, of course. I mean, going back to the Netflix, Blockbuster, or Kodak, I mean, whoever it is, whatever company, but you got to assess, does your culture align with the current market conditions, with the workforce? Obviously, we've got a lot of remote work now. And what does that look like to actually build a strong culture with a diverse and remote team, for example? Does it align with your organizational goals? And you've got to be able to adjust when necessary without losing your core identity. I mean, the fact that I just brought up Intel a few minutes ago, that's an example of that. I mean, a complete pivot. And you see other companies now, and then actually they're faced with another pivot right now where they're talking about, because obviously with NVIDIA and the chips and the processing, like, how do we go to sort of more of a custom process? And they just had huge rounds of layoffs in the last month or two. And then I think not the last, but one other thing I'll mention is just making sure you're rewarding and recognizing those behaviors, because, what you reinforce, what you manage, what you measure, all those things will help build on the shared values. So I think it's looking at, as a leader, what are the unspoken assumptions that might be undermining what we say we do, right? Does our culture align with our business goals and strategy? How do we model and reward behaviors? And again, you talk about culture. It's not just a soft thing or that thing we feel. It's not intangible. It's the backbone of any organization's ability to thrive. You've got to build it intentionally and equip people and, put in all those systems that are aligned to create a successful organization.
Absolutely, and Benjamin Franklin said something that I think we ought to rebound on, which is, failing to plan is planning to fail. When you're thinking about the role of strategic plannings in not only culture assessments but any sorts of operations and process in generals, how do you specifically, I suppose, consult with companies to rethink strategies for sustainable success? We talk about sustainable success quite a bit now in this modern world, and perhaps the ways in which you can identify growth opportunities in advance to be proactive instead of reactive. How I suppose relevant is that, and how does that intertwine with some of your work you do with some of your enterprise?
Well, I think in many cases, you've got to look at, you've got to be aware of what's happening externally. And I think particularly for leaders today to understand not just the current needs, but where things are going. And I always think about Wayne Gretzky. He talked about, I skate to where the puck's going to be, not to where it's at. And I think it's the same thing for a leader. And I know up in Canada, hockey's a big thing, right? And so, when you talk about strategic planning, it's defining the direction, setting the priorities, allocating the resources. And it's oftentimes a lot what I see organizations are focused on the short-term objectives, and particularly if they're a publicly traded company, obviously they're balancing Wall Street and other investors' expectations. So to be able to do that can be a challenge. But I think different things. It's really understanding why do they exist, and as a business strategist that helps people and companies move from where they are to where they want to be. That transformation is key to figure out like why do we exist, what do we stand for, where are we going, and being able to adapt to change because you probably heard the term VUCA, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments. And without strategic planning, if you don't have the ability to anticipate those disruptions and pivot when necessary, you're going to be out of business. And so in that process, to think about the different scenarios of what could happen are really key, to make sure that an organization is thinking about worst case scenarios. Like, what are the things, in many cases, it's not who you're competing with today. It may be who else could we be competing with next month, next year, 5 years from now? What does that look like? And how are different technologies going to impact that, the resource allocation, and figuring out like, what do we need to stop doing that no longer serves us? What do we need to start doing that, maybe is going to be really key? What is our core business? And even going back to in search of excellence, they talk about sticking to your knitting. What are your core competencies that if you outsourced, you could be out of business potentially? What are those things that, you do really well that are so central to your identity, your brand, that you don't want to outsource? But ultimately start, what do you want to start, stop? What do you want to continue doing? Those things are really key. And then there's some other different layers to that I like to look at in the strategic planning process to help a company really identify it. But it's that help foster innovation, but it's creating room for experimentation and growth. I'm a big fan of pilots and seeing things. And the other thing, like right now, since I have an AI company as well called Innovate AI Systems, where we are helping the organization leverage technology and making sure that they're going to be around. Peter Diamandis this is said, by the end of this decade, there's going to be two types of companies: those that are using AI and those that don't exist. And it was interesting. I was doing a book workshop with actually one of the nation's leading publishers, published my last book using AI. We had a bunch of people yesterday on a virtual meeting writing a book in 4 hours. It was incredible. And I didn't even realize he's published over 15,000 books and with a lot of thought leaders like Dan Sullivan and John Lee Dumas, Ed Milet, Rachel Peterson. The list goes on and on. And I mentioned that quote, and he's like, "Oh, I'm working on a book with him now." Like, so he's publishing, his next book for Peter Diamandis. But it's like, anyways, I think or, the Google CEO, former Google CEO, is saying AI is as big as electricity. If an organization is not paying attention to AI, if an individual is not paying attention, they better be. And that, through Innovate AI Systems, that's why we're passionate about training businesses to be able to do that and understand the type of infrastructure they need to create to pivot so they do exist at the end of this decade, how to train in their employees, how to lay the infrastructure, and where all the different considerations they need to have in place to be able to adapt to that change, allocate their resources, and measure the progress.
Yeah. And I love what you're going with this because technology is, we live in such an basically changing business landscape now. It's quite staggering just how much technology empowers our life and will continue to do for decades. When you're thinking about the AI revolution, I'd love to dive deeper into this because that's definitely an area that you cover at length and I think in beautiful fashions. One of the many things that I saw was we need to stop to think about AI which is in only the automation basically line. AI is truly about augmenting human capabilities. That's the bottom line of it. We could be better humans, not only better people, more efficient, more productive human beings through AI. So that's always how I like to tackle that questions. It's building better AI to basically help human becoming better itself. But when you're thinking about how it obviously shapes and enhance productivity, automate tasks, improve customer service, This quote of yours you just mentioned, I think is by far the best way to summarize it. Which is, in 10 years there will be the companies using AI and companies that doesn't exist anymore. Tell me more about the urgency. Let's say a company now that has no idea what even AI means. How big of a threshold perhaps it is for them to catch up to their competitors, and how much of a pressing needs perhaps would it be for them to not only take a look at it but a very serious one.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where they're at in the marketplace and how large a company it is, because the reality is, and there's a lot of good data out there from CEOs and leaders, particularly among the Fortune 500 companies, that, where they are today and where they're going to be in another year or two or three, they are investing heavily into AI, and they recognize that need to move and pivot. And so if you're not doing it, chances are your competitor is right now, if you're one of those larger companies. For the smaller companies, the SMBs, mid-size, there's still not as many, but we're in that. If you're familiar with Everett Rogers and his adoption of diffusion curve, we've got the innovators, we've got the early adopters right now. We're still in that early adopter phase, but when we get to that early majority, which is considered crossing the chasm, and we're not far off, you can look at an example where, like, like something like Netflix, a company like that, and how quickly things have changed in terms of how Chat GPT was adopted, versus things like that. I think Netflix, don't quote me, but I think it was like 3.5 years for them to get to a million users. Um, Chat GPT did that in a day and a half, something like that, something crazy. And they hit 100 million users within the close to, not quite, of the first year, and they just hit 200 million users at the end of August. And so you think about how quickly that is being adoptive and how it's being used. You've got to get on board. I mean, because the chance of being disruptive, and because the efficiency that you mentioned, automating processes and becoming more profitable, and also the things that it allows you to do in personalization, improving customer service, response times, all those other things, they're game changers. And so, with a lot of the companies we work with, what we see is often a savings of 75% of time or money once they realize and get these processes in place, whether it's an AI agent or training their employees in general, even training a leader on how to use AI for their personal use. They can get a day back in their week, at least 20%, if not more productive, by understanding how AI can be used as a hack to be able to augment what they're doing. And I think that's the key. And even there was a ghostwriter, and actually there was another publisher on this thing yesterday, and they were like, yeah, when I first started talking to them about, they're like, yeah, we're not going to use AI for book writing. I work with my authors, I do this and that. I was like, I'd love to just have you come and check it out and understand this is something that you can use. You're not just using AI without your human voice, without shaping it. And I like to think about a 10-80-10, where 10% is your vision, 80% AI, and then 10% is you bringing more of your stuff to it, refining it, enhancing it, giving it your voice in the context of writing a book. He was blown away because he finished his book, and then he was doing other things. He took his book. He's published already 9 different books. He's published dozens of books. This wasn't the one that, we developed the tool with. But at any rate, he took his book and he created his signature talk, because he's got another business helping people speak on stages. He created that in minutes. He said this would have taken weeks when he works with authors to craft their signature talk. He's also very involved with the National Speakers Association. And then we also create custom AI songs. So he took his thing, created some lyrics, and now you can have a song now, and other things. He had another process. He says it's a 3-day process. He did it in less than a minute. He is a raving fan now, but he set aside his skepticism to come to this 4 hours, and he was so grateful because he didn't think, there's any way in hell he would walk out with a first draft of a book from zero to having a draft. And I think that's the thing, that you don't know what's happening. How are your competitors using AI to leverage their time? And that analogy applies. I mean, And if your competitors are doing that and you're not going to be in business.
One thing that is so interesting to me is how different our understanding of what an idea is has changed in quite a rapid time, in thousands of years, but it's still quite rapid when you take a look at the perhaps just the evolution of Earth in itself, which is obviously billions of years. Socrates very famously said, "Weak mind discuss people, average mind discuss events, strong mind discuss ideas." But we live in a world now where the best ideas can be communicated by a computer. For example, AI very often now give ideas to human beings and not the other way around, which is, I think, quite fascinating. Now, let me ask you a moral question. When you believe of what it is to have a novel, a unique piece of work, how much will we be able to distinguish? Let's take the book because that's a good example. How much will we be able to distinguish work basically in copyrights perhaps that is novel and that is completely yours if AI was writing it for you? Do you think that there will ever become a point where there will be somewhat of a moral duty of human beings to still perhaps own in on the place of human beings in creative work?
Well, so, that's a really good question. We've seen this same pattern throughout history. You can go back to the printing press and other things where people started putting things in writing and capturing information and knowledge. I mean, very different than the days of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, where you're in a courtyard sharing information that you could actually share, all information that was known to man, like back then. Now you can't. Information's doubling, at an exponential rate. I mean, you're talking days that it's doubling. So I think the challenge is this, and we had the same challenge as an educator about like, what is your work and the intellectual property, plagiarism, like all those, distinctions. And I think ultimately we're already seeing, other tools out there that are trying to figure out, did you use AI or not? And I know firsthand cases where, and we had this with some of the even plagiarism tools where someone would turn in a paper and they would say you're plagiarizing, and then you go look and they're plagiarizing their own stuff or something else or derivative. So you've got to do a deeper dive. Now, in the case of a book, there's other tools out there that can help you very quickly identify the source and things and go back to that and tell you, is this drawing from that? And then you have to evaluate that. But you look at knowledge. I mean, everything that's in the public domain, like it's out there. So I've read probably well over 1,000 books, and it's like, I couldn't tell you like where did I get that idea from? I know people that do have that photographic memory that could tell you on page 23 of this book, like yourself, probably what exactly I read. But so there's things that, as I'm sitting down that have shaped my philosophy and thinking that I know I'm going to tie in. And how do I figure out, where did I was that an original idea or was that something else? Or, those concepts. So I think it's a really fine line and a slippery slope to try to figure out how to do that. But there's no question there's going to be tools around that. I have an AI avatar so people can talk to my voice. They can talk to me, virtually, an image of me talking back to them. So there's things like that you can do. And, what's scary is there's a lot of deep fakes. And so the technology around detecting that as well is going to evolve, and fake news and other things. There's a lot of risks. So we've got to figure out the guardrails. And I think that's the biggest thing that is around the ethics of AI that's concerning, because I think AI is a powerful tool, but ultimately the responsibility to produce truly novel work is going to lie with us as humans. And if we can integrate AI and maintain our moral integrity, we can ensure originality and uphold the trust in a world that's increasingly influenced by technology. Because without doing that, it's going to be scary. The potential is there.
No, it is. It is, absolutely. And we don't want it to get away from us, because education is very much a driver for transformations. And I love some of what your work with that you were doing with Western Governors University, actually, and some of your role in pioneering basically what we call competency-based educations. Let me start there, because I know a lot of people, and even myself, perhaps prior to reading this, did not ever basically came across this idea of competency-based education. Can you dive a little bit deeper into it and what it is specifically?
Yeah, for sure. And timely, because I actually just presented at the annual competency-based education conference last week. Um, Even though it's been years since I've been at Western Governors. But competency-based education is basically an approach that focuses on mastering specific skills or competencies rather than progressing through a curriculum or a course based on the time you spend in class. Unfortunately, there's a lot of systems in higher education and education in general based on funding and the Carnegie unit. And I won't get into all the depth, but there's traditional metrics like credit hours that are financial aid dependent and everything else that measures seat time. But the fact that you went through a course or whatever grade level doesn't mean you learned anything. And so Western Governors is really an outgrowth of that to prioritize outcomes over those traditional metrics. And it's a disruptive model. And Clayton Christensen talked about it as well, because of the traditional university system, and I've been in a number of them. There's competing priorities. Are you actually teaching? Are you doing research? Are you doing consulting? I even had a colleague at one of the universities I was at as a professor said, this is the best job in the world if it wasn't for the students. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, like you're at a university, you're a professor, but she was all about the research and stuff. But the CBE is really making sure that students can show and actually demonstrate they can apply a skill or concept before advancing. And it gives flexibility. Because the traditional education system, when you think about the GI Bill and everything else that's evolved, was geared towards the workplace and building a workforce and people you could fit in a square peg or whatever, plug them in, the automation industrial mindset. And the reality is, as we move to the knowledge, worker, something also Drucker popularized, the knowledge economy, it's very different. And so rather than assuming every student comes in knowing the same thing and they're going to learn at the same pace and they're going to all leave doing, knowing something, that's not the case. I mean, so CBE allows you to personalize and tailor the needs. You figure out where a student starts. What do they already know? What don't they know? Where's that gap? And then how do you assess it? And so there's a lot of high stakes assessment. And they were a pioneer. And Western Governors actually was very forward thinking. It goes back to what we were talking about strategically, because in the 90s, the Western Governors Association has been around for well over 100 years. It was originally founded around water rights, the Western U.S. Governors from the western part of the U.S. that came together to solve these things. And they were having a conversation in the 90s, say there's going to be a point in time where education is going to be out of the reach for the middle class, where the cost of healthcare is going to be too much, where the roads and infrastructure, we're not going to be able to maintain it. And we've got to come up with an alternative education model. And so they did that, and they're the first across. They've got a lot of distinctions. Most people don't know this. The U.S., the largest university in the U.S., who is it? Western Governors University. They are pushing 180,000 students now, and you can compare that to like a Texas A&M that's got maybe 80,000, maybe pushing that. You got 100,000 students in a Texas A&M system across all their different campuses. So it's a very progressive system that separates who's doing the teaching, who's doing the assessing, who's doing the mentoring and different things. And progress is determined by passing those assessments, the projects, the real world tasks, rather than spending a set amount of time in class. And the biggest thing is they focus on real world relevance, only offer those programs that are in high demand by industry. And it's completely online. So yeah, it's a game changing, and there's a lot of institutions right now, and there's a lot more than involved in offering CBE now, because they recognize it, because the cost, the ROI on traditional education. And I know that, having two daughters, that one that recently graduated and the other one's still in the mix, it's, a 6-figure plus proposition to get somebody to a bachelor's degree. So that's probably more than you need to know. I could talk for hours about Western Governors and that, but education needs significant disruption. And that's why I still have actually another company that I founded many years ago coming out of Western Governors called Higher Ed Change. And it's helping organizations adapt CBE. I wrote a LinkedIn article just like last week about how those same concepts apply to training and development in an organization and how you adapt that in different ways. So that's a little bit about CBE, but it is something that's well past its time. And we really need to figure out how we do that. If 19 US governors said, like, we need an affordable, workforce-aligned approach to this, others need to recognize that. And the tuition is ridiculously inexpensive. I'm still a raving fan and supporter of what they're doing, even though I haven't been there for years. But it was really around healthcare, business, IT, and education. Those are the four primary fields, and I led the business stuff for them.
It's fascinating this model, and there's a crying need for this model. We're both obviously a big fan of Mr. G.W. Wilson that talked at length how most of what we're doing now in education is still based on model that are 2,000 years old, and there's definitely a need for innovation in that space. Let me ask you a witty questions. How far are we from the Eric Goodman the bot to replace you as the person that is actually training at Western Governors University? How far are we from that?
Well, the technology exists. I have my bot. I could probably, that's something that's very, very, very possible. And actually coming out of this conference last week, and I was at the world's largest AI education summit this spring out in California. There's a lot of innovative things happening. So I think though it's also about augmenting and how do you utilize that? So even with my bot, if you will, whether it's chat, audio, or visually seeing me and talking with me, that right now brings a different dimension, and it allows me to scale my time where it's one to many because it's taken up my brain, if you will, at least parts of my knowledge to program and train it. And there's still a ways there, but I think that's definitely an interesting avenue to begin exploring, for sure. And then even the assessment that's happening now, what's possible with AI and video. And I demoed some of the new companies that are out there. It's pretty cool. It's particularly around the soft skills. And there's an organization and a skills thing in the US that's got, a dozen competencies and 100 plus different sub competencies, but now they can do the role play simulation, video based, and actually using AI, analyze it, sentiment analysis, all the emotions, if you're training a leader, to give them feedback very quickly on, how they're doing. And I think that's the biggest thing. And so when you look at something like CBE, competency-based education, it's so much more powerful. And I think the other part of it is, it gets away from your bot question, but I think it's important. And the thing that strikes me is I'm a huge proponent of growth mindset, Carol Dweck's work, where it's a fixed mindset. And it wasn't till later it dawned on me, like what they're doing in this model is you don't get a failing grade. You just haven't passed yet. So it encourages people to approach things like that. And Gallup has a national poll they do. And what they found is WG graduates are twice as likely to be engaged at work compared to graduates from other institutions. And then when you look at all the other community-based, civic mindedness, other things that they're doing, they are thriving at much higher levels than students coming out of these Ivy League or other state university systems. And I do think it is because it's a shift in the mindset around learning to say, you know what, you just haven't learned it yet. So at any rate, we will see some of those things coming soon. And I may be actually involved based on some of the things I'm working on in more ways than you think in terms of the education space and bringing things like that, not just to education, K-12 higher ed, but to the corporate space in terms of how you can use that. And of course, with the training and development that I do through i3 Empowerment Solutions, it's an adjunct, and even with coaching programs I offer, to be able to provide that support 24/7 to people. It's really powerful.
It is. And that's again such an interesting concept. I think that you understand more than pretty much anyone that I ever come across is leverage. This understanding that how many companies are you running as we speak, or somewhat implicated
technically
within?
I still have 4 active companies.
Yeah, 4 active companies. How many children do you have?
I have two.
You have 2 children, 4 companies. You have a wonderful wife, which I was able to meet actually. Where was that? That was Scottsdale, right? At the time I met your wife.
Yeah, I don't remember where we were at. I think you might have met her out in Arizona when we were at an event.
That's right, Arizona. Yeah, that's right. I think you're right. And so you have all these things, and that's a little bit out of school, but I want you very slowly, very, very, I suppose, concisely tackle it because I think there's some incredible nuggets of wisdom there. Were you always like that? Were you somebody always super productive and kind of like with the urge of always finding leverageable way to better himself, but also, I suppose, the world at large? Where does that come from in your character?
Well, that's such a good question, and I'll share. I think I know where that came from in part. I was about 9 years old. It may have been eight. I don't remember exactly, but I had just won a contest selling world's finest chocolate bars. It's like a fundraiser thing. These chocolate bars you'd go sell for a school, and we were going to be going to a wedding, and actually, I think it's probably somehow in my DNA because my grandfathers, both of them had businesses. I never met them; they passed before I was born. But ultimately, we went to a retail clothing store, and this was a distant relative of mine that I didn't know existed or whatever. And I was sort of fascinated. My dad grew up on the south side of Chicago in the projects, and I was that kid wearing the Sears tough skins and, not a lot of money growing up. But so it was cool in that I went in to get a jacket and I was just fascinated by sort of like, you own this place? Like, how is that possible? Like these people, and he started explaining, his employees and a little bit more. It was my first sort of taste of a business where I knew somebody that could share some insight. And he said, wherever you are, whatever you do, you're always selling something. So the fact that you just won, and I won an audio cassette recorder. I remember that back. You don't know probably what an audio cassette is based on your age, but
No, no, I know what it is. I
first
know what
time
it
I
is.
heard my voice, and it was really cool. But I was excited about that. And he said that's probably one of the most important skills in life is understanding how to sell, how to influence others. And he explained to me, like, he asked me if I had friends, and I'm like, he asked, how did I get them? And I'm like, that's a really good question. How did I get them? I don't know. Like we have commonalities, we have things. He's like, well, it's influence. It's like there's things that you connected about. And he asked if I had a girlfriend, and I said, no, I don't know. They got cooties. Like, I he's like, well, there's a point in time, and now I've been married 27 years. So he was right that, it's that, but whether it's an employee for him, he explained how he needed to attract customers into his store by selling them and selling him a potential person to come work for him, or those people that were working, if they wanted to raise a promotion, how they needed to do more. But what evolved out of that was I started selling candy. I'm like, why do I just need to sell this for a charity? Like I could make money off of this. And so I started going and buying candy. I'd ride my bike down to this corner store and buy candy and take it to school and sell it at recess. And then I started setting up the thing on weekends. Eventually, um, I met with him again. He's like, where are you buying your candy? I'm like, I'm going down there. He's like, did you know you could buy that wholesale? I'm like, what's wholesale? No, like, what is that? He's like, so we figured out a place across town, got my parents to drive me across town, and I stocked up. I mean, I just bought a ton of stuff. It was like Willy Wonka, like in the chocolate, like it was a literally store warehouse. And so we were able to get it at a little lower price. So my profit margins went up, and I then got involved with a landscaping company where I started mowing lawns. There's a lot of newspaper routes, but having other people then do that work and stuff. So yeah, I guess I was always in that sort of mindset. And really for me, part of my core, and when I started one of the companies I started many years ago doing, helping businesses optimize their performance, one of my sort of taglines was discovering, leveraging, and maximizing your performance. And so that idea of leverage, discovering it, leveraging, maximizing your performance has always been sort of, I think, part of that when I recognize like, oh, like how many lawns could I mow on my own? But like, what if I hire other people to mow these lawns? Like that's leverage, right?
It is. It is. And leverage is all any rich person ever got rich. It's always through leverage in one way or another. And that's something that you talk at such a young age. That's a beautiful story, by the way. Thank you so much for sharing. And it's very interesting because I think that marked the person that you are, because I follow some of your stuff on sales excellence and mindset and so on. And it's not only it is extremely quality information. So congratulations for everything you're doing. But one thing that always fascinated me, and I want to ask you this question directly, is in your work of training sales teams and salespeople in general, what would you say is the biggest hiccup? Is it the limiting belief that they have on themselves, so that basically they don't think they're deserving perhaps of being wealthy or deserving of any great outcomes, or is it just because of the value proposition being maybe a little bit weaker compared to competitors? How does that, I suppose, and I'm sure it's a mix of both, but in your observation, is there any one thing that you say that this is the biggest problem of sales teams, and perhaps talking a little bit about how you solve that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's clear that mindset is a big aspect of that. And I'll share an example. So I was doing some coaching with an individual who sells jets, $1 million planes, uh, top salesperson in their company, and yet she did not like to do cold calling, for example. And we literally, just by helping her work through that limiting belief that she had and approaching it differently, she more than doubled her sales, already being a top performer. And so I think that when you look at the idea of, mindset, it is probably one of the biggest things. I think the ability to communicate the value proposition, both are critical, but I would say mindset's the bigger hurdle because it underpins how salespeople approach the challenges, the rejection, the sales process themselves. Because without the right mindset, even if you have the best crafted value proposition, it's not going to land effectively. And so, fear of rejection, limiting beliefs, the lack of resilience, all those things come into play. And the other thing that I was blessed with was sort of unexpectedly having a friend invite me to a fire walk from Tony Robbins back in 1987 that exposed me to this whole area of neuro-linguistic programming. And so I went on, like, I'm just wired to learn. So I went on to learn. I became a practitioner and then a master practitioner, spending hundreds, if not thousands of hours, looking at this field and utilizing it in different ways. So to help people overcome those internal doubts, like I'm not I'm not a good salesperson, or the market's too competitive, or, like they're not buying because we got an election coming up. Everyone's pausing. Like, what are those beliefs? And, the other thing, which actually I'll give you another twist on the tool that I shared, the crackmycode.com/communicate tool, to help people understand their strengths. And I was sharing that in the context of emotional intelligence, but that tool itself was actually developed for sales, with the idea being that if people have different personalities, would you agree, Samuel, that that's the case?
Absolutely. Yes. There's not
Yeah.
only different personality, but biological preferences, ways they would like to be communicated to. All these things are very relevant.
Yeah. So when you understand that, and if they are different, they make buying decisions differently. So how can you reverse engineer it? So this is the quickest, easiest way of understanding how to get to a yes. And then one of the universities, actually Western Governors back many years ago, had a major in sales. There's only about 30 universities in the US that do. So I did a pretty deep dive in sales at that time. Most have a major in marketing, and you take maybe one or two sales courses. But at any rate, there's this idea of going for the no, and sales is a numbers game and all that. No, it's a people game. And if you understand that, and that's what my distant relative, like, it's about sales, it's about people, it's about connecting and building those relationships. And I think ultimately, when you understand that, I think I would put that value proposition a close second, because it still matters, because if you don't know how to articulate it, your prospect's going to be confused. They're not going to see the fit. But what you see too often is salespeople focus on the features rather than the benefits, and failing to connect with customers' pain points. And that's what I know you're amazing at, getting a deep understanding of the product, the customer. And without that, salespeople risk sounding generic or irrelevant, And so, I think the key is thinking about selling versus service. And, a lot of people like, am I serving others or am I selling them? Or is it like the leader with Simon Sinek? Am I leading, or am I in charge of those? It's sort of a shift in the mindset, because if you believe you got the best product, if you believe you're doing somebody a favor and that they need you more than you need them, and if they say no, it's their loss. And it may just not be their time yet, because as you know, most people are not closing on the first conversation. There's a lot of statistics about that out there. It's 5, 8, 10, 12, connections before they're doing that. But yet most salespeople are not following up. That's the biggest issue. There's a lot of great data from Salesforce.com about that too. So,
Oh yeah, the gold mine, the gold mine is in the follow-ups, no doubt. And one thing that I love as a way to perhaps see this interaction in the first place is, in my opinion, sales are way more contingent upon the attitude of the salesmen and not the attitude of the prospects. How many times do we hear, well, I didn't close this person because perhaps it was close, it was stress or external factors, and maybe even if you're right, perhaps because maybe you are, that's not discriminating perhaps your understanding of the situations, but as a salesperson, coming in with the convictions that what you have will help them more than what basically they're giving you in exchange is the utmost importance. Because if you don't believe such things will be true, nobody, well, all right, it's always this interesting paradox of, if you don't believe in yourself, why should anybody believe in you? It's just the way it is. And that's the case for any service, products, individuals, and I go as far as ideas. And to me, the way in which you've been able to master not only the communications, meaning the language, but also the tools that you can use in order to leverage those things, are not only so relevant but also extremely effective, and that they therefore extremely impactful. So some of your work, I think, is definitely deserving of very, very thorough examinations. And one thing that I absolutely love as well, which I went to the Achieve System University basically earlier on this year, which was my first time. You're also very close to that groups in the Achieve Academy portions, which is yet another one of your ventures and projects you're doing with educations. When you're thinking about how you help professionals in teaching them and leading them through workshops, certifications, online courses. You were talking about books. For you specifically, as somebody that is obviously a wealth of knowledge and a lifelong learner, um, when you want to master any skills in the modern age, what medium and what channels is the best bang for your bucks in your experience? Is it to sit down and read? Is it to take an online course? Is it to go in person for a workshop? Tell me more about what you think is perhaps the best ROI or the most, I suppose, effective ways to learn these days.
Well, again, each person is going to be different. I think that's the starting point. And, there's not a lot of conclusive work. I mean, a lot of the research was around visual, auditory, kinesthetic learners and things, learning styles and whatnot. But clearly, you can think about like how you learn best personally, and like what are the courses or trainings or workshops. Do you like to read a book? Do you like to listen to an audiobook? Do you like to be hands-on doing stuff? What does that look like in terms of the learning process? So there's not one best way for everybody. I think the key is understanding the neuroscience behind learning, and that's where the meaning and is so key. And are you activating the meaning network, and are you building those neural pathways and activating those in a way that you're actually learning? And there's a science behind that. And you can look at people, like people that popularize it, like Malcolm Gladwell with the 10,000 hours, or you've got a certain amount of time. No, it depends, because there's a lot of variables that play into that. That was based on some work by Anders Ericsson, where he extrapolated that. But I think the biggest thing is, regardless of what you're doing, is you got to be deliberate about it. And I think getting to mastery, it's not about innate talent, but it's about consistent, purposeful effort. And if you break down and have specific goals that are tangible, and in the case like that data, that 10,000 hours was based on a study in Vienna of students at a music institute, and like, what does it take and how many hours are they spending? But you've got to be specific, and it's not like I want to get better at piano. You got to say, I want to master these 3 scales, or I want to master this technique. And it's breaking it down, getting feedback from others, pushing beyond your comfort zone, having variation in different scenarios, tracking your progress. Obviously, if you have a mentor that's been there, done that, that gets you there way more quickly, because you can accelerate your learner. And the other part of it is a lot of research around visualization, mental rehearsal. We know that from athletes. We know that in any field. And I use that as well in training leaders and salespeople to mentally rehearse the desired outcomes and the steps, because it's as good, almost, because it's activating the brain, it's priming the brain for success, and help them overcome performance anxiety. People that were terrified of speaking on a stage or things like that, I can help them very quickly overcome those limiting beliefs and things, and understand how they can do that. And there's a lot of other things with mindfulness and other flow state things that can help. And I think the other thing is, I'm reminded, besides Erickson's work, of Josh Waitzkin, who was the chess prodigy, martial artist. If you haven't read his some of his work, The Art of Learning, seminal stuff. I mean, I would definitely look at that, because he talks about the difference between internal mastery and adaptive learning, and how you embrace the fundamentals. And again, even going back to George Leonard wrote a book called Mastery 2. I think, the bottom line is everybody's going to be different. It's identifying, understanding how you learn best, but there's consistency, whether it is in person, if it's attending a workshop, if it's reading on your own, if it's an online course. You got to figure out what works for you and what discipline you have and support. It's just no different than going to work out. Some people need to go to a gym to work out and have a coach to hold them accountable. That's why I've got some clients where I've got one person I talk to every day, even just a brief call, but he needs that accountability. So just a quick 5-minute, like focusing on what are you focusing on today? What were your wins? What are your challenges? Just really quick, but to be able to have somebody that can help you continue to move towards mastery. And I think if you've got a way to tailor that based on an individual's learning style, goals, and strengths, and that's where that, even the personality stuff, it is indirectly tied to that. And I've trained that in education, both K-12 and higher ed, to help teachers understand how this relates to enhance the learning outcomes. And it definitely does when you understand how to guide the learner in ways and setting up the appropriate systems and feedback loops and celebrating the milestones to help them.
Beautiful. Mastery is a state of mind. Mr. Robert Greene actually is one of my favorite authors with The Art of Mastery. Mr. Eric Goodman, it was such a pleasure to have you on the Meaningful Podcast today. I think I counted in my head, I have quite an extensive memory, at least 53 beautiful insights during the length of this podcast, which is quite incredible in such a short amount of times. Thank you so much for your time and your dedication to your craft. Would you like to perhaps say any last words for our audience, please?
I think I would say this, because given the name of your podcast, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about meaning just really quickly. And I think for me, one of the most powerful things I've ever read or experienced related to meaning is Man's Search for Meaning, a book by Viktor Frankl, who created the field of logotherapy, that without meaning, or without purpose, people will perish. And he was a Holocaust survivor. And so I think for people, and that's why one of the programs we have at i3 Empowerment Solutions is called Ignite Your Passion. It's about helping people figure out and discover, so they can discover their purpose and figure that out. Because the meaning of life is to find your gift, and then the purpose of life is to give it away. I mean, it's something that Picasso said. And I think, for meaning perspective is finding the why. And when you find the why, and I love quotes, so I'm sorry I rattle off that in books, but Nietzsche, he who has a reason why can bear almost anyhow. And I think for people, when you're struggling and trying to figure out, like, why is this happening to me, recognizing, no, it's happening for you. There's a reason behind it, and there's something that's meant to happen. So I think if you're open to growth and those possibilities, I think that's key. And the other thing to remember, I think just in life, because it relates to so many things we talked about, is it's not personal, it's personality. Whether it's an employee, whether it's your boss, whether it's a customer. And if you understand that, and particularly in sales, because when you understand the system, I typically see conversion rates go from 20, 25% to 75, 80%. It's game changing. But it's the same thing as a leader. When you understand that about people, how to sell, how to influence others, emotional intelligence. In my mind, all these things I'm doing fit together beautifully, because it is, you nailed it. It's all about leverage and figuring out how do you leverage your time, which is what led me to AI and to starting a company in AI, because it's an enabler. And there's nothing that changes the game as much as having more time, because at the end of life, most people would gladly, they're not going to be worried about, I wish I would have spent more time working. Like, no, it's not that way. So how do you get your time back? How do you live a aligned life? And I love what you're doing with your podcast and helping people think through purpose, meaning, and these important pressing questions that can help them be better in their own life and really be true to themselves. I would just encourage you, in the words of Les Brown, to live fully and die empty.
Thank you for spending your time with us today on the Meaningful Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review or share it with someone who could benefit from it. And always remember, your story matters. Make it meaningful. We hope to see you next time.